Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Chartered College of Teaching webinar. We really appreciate you joining us at what has no doubt been a very, very busy day. But I hope that it will be a very worthwhile hour for you now. I'm really thrilled that we're joined today by two people who have been really influential in teacher development over the past few years. First of all, I'm thrilled that we're joined by Oliver Caviglioli, who was a special school head teacher for a decade and learnt as a teacher how to combine the skills he learned from educational psychologists with graphic know-how that he'd been taught in childhood from his architect father. Based on this kind of unique combination of experiences, Oliver became an information designer, visualizing educational ideas and processes. And this has been a big part of a kind of transformation that we've seen recently in how teachers use visual explanations. Particularly popular in that area was his book, Dual Coding with Teachers. But most recently, he's also worked on a project with Tom Sherrington, who's also joining us today. Tom started teaching in 1987 and has had a 30-year career in education. He is now highly in demand as a consultant and a conference speaker, so we're thrilled to have him here tonight, working with schools and colleges, improving teaching, curriculum and assessment. He's the author of The Learning Rainforest, Rosenshine's Principles in Action, and most importantly for tonight, along with Oliver Caviglioli, the book Teaching WalkThrus. And that's what we're going to be talking through. The way this evening will work is that we'll have some sort of general discussion led by me to begin with. I'm going to try not to hog the time of Tom and Oliver too much. It's one of the most exciting parts of my job, getting to do this. But then importantly, we'll go into a chance for Q&A from the audience. So you'll be able to share through the chat at the side of this stream any questions that you have, any comments that you have. We love seeing the comments and responses. It's really great for me to be able to feed those into conversations. So do make sure that you're sharing those. We'll also be sharing in the chat various links that might be useful related to some of the things that Tom and Oliver are talking about. And there'll also be a link later on to just a reminder that you can get a discount on Tom and Oliver's book using your Chartered College membership, should you wish to. So without further ado, I'm going to move into asking some questions. I want to make the most of this time. So Tom, your new book is all about kind of presenting some of the most important techniques and strategies for classroom teachers and what those look like in practice. So I wondered if you wanted to just dive straight in, really, with talking through. There's quite a lot of techniques in there, but what do you think are the most crucial techniques that you introduce and why those matter?
Well, I always hesitate to do this because one of the things I want to say is that there's no sort of a hierarchy of these, and that there's not some strategies which kind of are better for some people than others. And we're always trying to sort of push this back to people to say, you really do need to evaluate what your students need in terms of improving their learning, and then select strategies which are going to help them to learn more. And it's not so much about you personally being a better sort of teacher so much as your students learning more effectively through the things you select. And so everybody can choose things. I mean, I have some things which I kind of find I reference more often. So even just today, I posted a blog where just to sort of say, well, there are three things which I find, if you can do these well, it just makes a massive difference. And they're things I recommend because I often see people not doing them. So those would be cold calling, questioning, pair share, so getting students talking, and checking for understanding. And if you synthesize those three things into effective routines, and everyone knows how they work, you get really good discussion, you get really good checking for understanding, and you get everyone involved in quite a sort of dynamic way. So those three I think are really, really powerful as a combination. But that's just because I just often see people not doing those things nearly as well as they could. But some people are already doing those things, so they would have another set of strategies which are more important to them. They aren't inherently the most important strategies. You know what I mean? I'm trying to be clear about that. Otherwise, you end up people saying, "Oh, there's like a hierarchy of preference," and I really don't think there is really. It's just my sort of sense of what I find myself referring to commonly.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and of course it depends completely on the context of what it is that you're trying to achieve at that moment, which strategies that you adopt. And I think that's one of the kind of things that you develop with the expertise that you develop in your experience as a teacher, is knowing which strategies are the right ones to adopt in which times, and what's going to work most effectively. I did notice your blog earlier, and I hoped that was some excellent preparation for tonight's webinar, and thought that's very efficient work, Tom. You mentioned there cold calling, which has come up a bit on Twitter in the last couple of days. would be fair to say. Do you want to talk through, I know, as you said, many in the audience will already be using this, whether by that name or another name, but do you want to talk through a bit of what cold calling is, what it looks like in practice, what makes it effective? You happy to do that?
Can I share the walkthrough? Because the walkthrough screen I've got, if I can share my screen, I'm not sure how this works. If I've got the walkthrough for cold calling here, if I actually present this, can you see that?
Yep, that's up on the screen for everyone. Thank you, Tom.
So this is the walkthrough for cold calling. It's almost like we rehearsed this. It's amazing, but there it is. And for me, it's a very, it has this name because it comes from Doug Lamol's Teach Like a Champion. Some people react against it, but essentially what it means is you should be ready to answer a question at any point. Like cold calling means someone could call you at any moment. And I think that's a perfectly normal thing. But it's a warm invitation to participate. So what it should feel like is, you ask the class a question, but you don't allow hands up or calling out, which forces everybody to have to think about good answers. Because everybody knows that you could ask them to respond, they're having to engage. So they're thinking, what's the answer to the question? What do I know? What do I not know? So you give some thinking time, and then you select someone to respond. So this is the key bit. You scan the room and you decide who you're going to invite to participate at that moment. And it could be the person you asked before. It could be someone who might otherwise never put their hand up, or it could be someone who's very keen, always puts their hand up, and you just know the kids in your lesson and you choose somebody to answer, and you'll say, yeah, what are you all thinking? What are you thinking? Let you join in, and then you respond to their answers. I think this is a key part that we describe in our version, which is that you don't just say, very good, well done, and move on to someone else. You say, that's interesting. Why did you think of that? Or what else could you say? Or well, how did you work it out? Like, in other words, you engage with their answer, and then you select another student. So your cold calling is this feeling of you selecting a range of students to engage in sort of short dialogue. So that's how we see it. It's not a gotcha. You're not sort of trying to catch kids out and make them feel. It's the opposite. You're being really explicit that absolutely everybody in the class is welcome to be involved, but you have to then manage that. Otherwise you have hands up or calling out, and both of those things kind of destroy some students' willingness to engage, and they opt out. And you see that all the time in schools where kids have kind of decided not to participate. So that's if I stop the share there. I mean, that is how I see how I see it working. Oh, look, we've gone into infinite screen, but so for me, cold calling, defined in that way, which is what the walkthroughs do. They define the strategy, is a really inclusive strategy. It's very but it has to happen routinely for all the students to know that when you've asked a class the question, that means them to think as well as everybody else.
Yeah, and I think an important element of this, of course, is having a classroom where there is a sort of sense of trust, because one of the challenges I think that people raise with cold calling is that there are students who will feel very nervous about the idea that they're going to be picked on, they're going to be asked to answer a question that they might not know the answer to, and that they're going to be embarrassed in some way. I mean, how do you kind of tackle that if you know that there's a student who feels very uncomfortable with being asked a question in a classroom environment?
It's funny because I get asked that all the time, but I think it's something you have to be aware of. But the worst thing you can do is just say, oh gosh, you don't do questions, and let them sink into this sort of pit of resistance and self-doubt. What you do is you say, okay, you're a bit awkward, but don't worry, and let's hear. You ask questions to everybody in an invitational way, which includes a sort of, you say things like, what were you thinking? Did you have an answer? Do you think you've got an answer? What do you think? And you ask in a sort of tentative way, which allows the kids to say, well, we weren't sure, but it could be this. And once you see that modeled around the room, the less confident kids think, oh, it's okay. I don't have to be right. I don't have to be bang on. I can just say, you say, what were you thinking? Did you have an answer? And they can say, well, no, we weren't really sure. I wasn't sure. And as long as you keep modeling that as an acceptable way of participating, less confident kids feel that's normal. If it's always right, celebrate. The kids who aren't sure are thinking, oh my God, everyone knows stuff, and they start to hide and mask and skulk back. And then being asked the question is like horrific. So you have to create the tone where tentativeness, uncertainty, wrongness is all part and parcel. The other more deliberate one is to link it with the pair share. So if you've got a couple of very shy students, what you would do is you'd say, well, let's have a pair discussion about this. So in your pair, I want you to come up with a blah, blah, blah. You set them off talking, and then you let them talk to their partner, and you might deliberately kind of check in with their pair discussion and say, while everyone else is talking, just say, how are you guys getting on? What do you think? Privately. And then you might volunteer, you might say to the class, well, Siobhan had a really good point earlier. What she was saying was this, and you sort of show Siobhan that her answer is actually all right, and you can share them with the class. So there's loads of ways in, but what you've got to do is the principle is I need to find a way for you to participate, not I'm going to make this awkwardness come some rigid embedded thing which we are never going to overcome by me never asking you any questions. I think that's the absolute worst thing.
Yeah, and I think something that comes across from how you talk about there is obviously the point here is one of the things that we do as a teacher that's different to just kind of online learning where everything's pre-prepared, is that actually you know your students, you know who you can ask what, you know who maybe on that day it's not the right person to pick on. We're not talking about necessarily a complete kind of randomizer to pick students, although there's a point, of course, that we need to make sure that we are covering a range of different students when we're doing this. But the point, the idea that that teachers will be doing things that make pupils really uncomfortable, I think misses the point that, of course, we know as teachers, we know our classes, we know our students, we're making decisions about who to ask, and as you've just framed it really well, what to ask them, how we can build that kind of culture of support and trust, but also high expectations, and as you said, make sure that everyone's sort of ready to answer questions, and that just becomes the culture of your classroom over time. It's not a kind of overnight activity, is it really?
No. And I do think this sort of thing of creating a culture where being wrong or unsure is normal is really key. So one of the ways that can be done is, say, when you've done a test or a quiz, you ask somebody who's got a pretty high score, but not a perfect score, to share some of the stuff they got wrong. And they're totally relaxed about it. I mean, they just go, yeah, you got 8 out of 10. Really, really well done. What ones you got wrong? And they're like, oh, yeah, I stuffed up number 6. Why? What did you say? And you're modeling wrongness. And once the less confident kids see that's okay, you just build it into the flow of a lesson. If you do the opposite, where you sort of hyper celebrate the perfect answers the whole time, it's really counterproductive for those weaker students. And you just create. I see it a lot actually when you sit in the back of a class. You see all this masking going on. I mean, kids are very good at it. They look to cadge answers off each other and do anything to show that they know, even though they don't really. And you've got to really be conscious of that. If you're creating a culture in a class where the kids will pretend to know stuff they don't, that's kind of down to you. And it's easily done unless you're thinking that could be a possibility. Is anyone pretending to know when they don't? Well, I need to open them up. I need to allow this error to sort of flow. Of course, I need to get it right at the end, but in these early stages, making sure that it's kind of normal to be uncertain has to be a strong feature of classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really helpful. What you showed there, obviously, was kind of what one of the walkthroughs looks like. And what I'd like to do now is to move on to Oliver, actually, to just find out a bit about why the book is structured how it is. So the sort of whole notion is that it shows these techniques in a very visual way that could be used helpfully, perhaps, to apply alongside instructional coaching as an approach to teacher professional development. So, Oliver, if you don't mind talking for a bit about why you felt this is an important way to represent these techniques, an important way to support teachers in developing their practice, that would be great.
Yeah, you saw me nip off to my library. I want to show you a book which was published decades and decades before the walkthroughs, and I'd forgotten I'd had it. And afterwards, I showed Tom gave him a couple of. Can you see that? Adam the Gardener. And there you have, look, broken down to steps with and that in itself looks remarkably similar to the walkthrough structure. So
basically, Oliver saying we nicked it.
Yeah. No, I saw it afterwards. It's nothing new. Visual communication, visual explanations has a long history. We chose the landscape because it gave a panoramic view, and so you didn't have to turn over. It was all in one view. And I have to say, we're also influenced by Nelson Cowan and his colleagues, who are referenced quite a lot with regard his updating of Miller's previous 7 ± 2 in terms of chunks of information that we can take in easily, which only belatedly was seen to be only for simple things. More complex things, and we need to reduce the steps. Because one thing you don't want to do as a teacher is be facing a class and thinking, what comes next? So you really need to be able to absorb it as one simple set. So the number of steps and the panoramic view, step by step, was a way that's really effective. And as Richard Mayer reminds us quite rightly, we learn better with a mixture of words and images. So they're Tom's words, my images. That's pretty much how it works. And of course, being landscape panoramic, from a practical point of view, it fits really well into a PowerPoint slide, the wide, that kind of side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this book and your previous book, Dual Coding, are the first two books that I've had that have been quite that shape. It sort of took me aback slightly in the first instance to get used to reading a book in that shape, but it certainly does help when you want to present these things on screen. I guess what would you say to people who might challenge this with the idea that actually it's oversimplifying something that's as complex as teaching is, that you can't break teaching down into a list of strategies with 4 or 5 steps?
I'm always keen to catch people out who invoke Michael Polanyi here, who say, oh, tacit knowledge, which kind of means hands off. It's a science, it's an art, it can never be quantified. And I just think that's a lazy excuse. It's a very elaborate and elegant excuse, but it's an excuse. Atul Gawande wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto, where he pretty much found, after looking at the medical profession, there aren't many, if at all, any professions whose skills and procedural knowledge that are being built up by experts can't actually be captured. So one of the things, and I'm going to link it to instructional coaching now, I've recently come across a phrase that I find really useful, which is that the method with which you depict and explain a technique should be both precise and provisional. So let me see what I mean by that. Because of my special school background, I'm probably one of the last people who taught direct instruction by Engelmann's very specific instructions, broken down some sort of 30 years ago. So I know that we can be precise. I also know there are problems when we're overly precise, and the behaviorist psychologists were sometimes over-optimistic that you can find the specific sequence, the specific word, and it will apply wherever you are. So the other side is, so it needs to be precise enough so that someone can pick it up, they can understand it, and they can execute it. But equally, the other side is it needs to be provisional. And what those in instructional coaching mean by provisional means it can be adapted. And Tom has created a wonderful 5-step process. Notice it's a 5-step process. It's an acronym, ADAPT, where it's a rigorous set of questions which would get you to define for yourself and explain to a partner or a coach the omissions and commissions. What have you left out? What have you put in extra? And explain your reasoning with regard to those particular students, a particular subject, or the time of year. So it's that balance.
Do you know, can I come in on that? Because I think this is really interesting. And I guess what we're sort of saying is, the purpose of the walkthroughs is, in the most part, isn't really to give you sort of precise step-by-step instructions like these are a rigid guide. We sort of simplify the idea to the point where it can be shared and communicated, but then it's like a springboard from putting it into context. So, cold calling, just that one example. I mean, you could be trying that in year 4, or you could be trying that in year 10 biology, or year 7 English. And all 3 of those different people could be talking about the same strategy, but the way it actually feels in the room would be very different from themselves because they're having to enact it. But the basic principle is there. But there are some precisions. So, for example, do you say, James, what's 7 cubed? Or do you say, hey, class, what's 7 cubed? And then pick James. Well, I think that's quite a definite swap to make and to be quite precise about. To say, no, if we want to involve everybody, we have to ask the question first, and then we select the student. And then it's worth being precise about that in that particular case, because otherwise it doesn't quite work as well. So there are some aspects of precision which are worth specifying. But Oliver and I, right from the very first time we ever sat down to talk about this, we were saying we're not creating some sort of like tick list, It's just never the principle of it at all. It's like it's how do we communicate ideas from A to B to person without them all falling apart? We have to have some way of saying what they could look like, which is where, you know, Oliver's thing, you know, I think you're going to talk about this in a bit maybe, but this is where the main purpose of the book is, are you clear what the things mean? But I don't think it shackles anybody. There's so many strategies in the book, even there's so many ways to spin off, and we're really encouraging people to take ownership of it.
Yeah, and there's definitely something to be said, isn't there, for just this notion of having shared vocabulary. You know, when we think about the nature of what makes a teaching something a profession, one of the features of an accepted profession is this idea of a shared body of knowledge. And it's been challenged that maybe we don't necessarily have that in teaching. I think there are different ways of looking at that, but one of the issues particularly is a lack of that kind of shared vocabulary about what we're talking about and what we're doing. And there's been a comment around, you know, what's this question of what's new about this? And this is something that teachers were doing 40 years ago. Absolutely the case. And again, with the recent debate about cold calling, we've also then seen people, you know, it's just questioning. But there are people who are doing it in this way, but it's a very specific form of questioning. And maybe that actually comes back to your point about tacit knowledge, Oliver, that people sort of almost instinctively do that because they think what I want is for the pupils not to know who's going to be asked, because if I ask the same person every time, then everyone else is having a lovely nap. It is perhaps instinctive, but actually if we have a shared way of talking about this and we have a really specific way of introducing it to new teachers in particular, rather than expecting them to kind of pick this up over time, that maybe they will learn that, they'll do some questioning, and then they'll suddenly realize that they're asking the same people all the time, or that the people who have put their hands up are ready to answer, but everybody else is knowing that someone with their hands up will be asked, so they don't need to respond. Rather than, it's almost breaking that kind of bit of sort of learning by trial and error, and perhaps being more specific in the first place about what we're doing, and having this shared way of talking about it is really helpful, I think. And that's one of the sort of things I wanted to talk about next, really, how this approach to professional development works. Instructional coaching as well is something that certainly wasn't around when I was training to teach, and seems to have really sprung up in popularity over the last sort of few years, and understanding how these approaches to developing teachers at all stages of their career work. So Oliver, do you want to sort of talk about what you're trying to do in terms of professional development here?
Yes, I've got a couple of slides and I want to continue that theme of time. So if you just allow me to show you my slides.
Yeah, they'll be up in just a moment.
Can you see them now, Kat?
Not yet, sorry. Hopefully Paul can get those up for a minute. They definitely shared your side, Oliver.
Oh, I need to go back to sharing screen. Okay, I can see them.
Yeah, just
can you see that now?
There we go. Yeah, perfect.
Hey, hold on.
You talked earlier on about there's nothing new, quite rightly, and we've been doing this all the time. Yet I had this experience. I've been training for 20 years now, and before that I was on the other side. And so many times, either within the audience or up front as a presenter, I've heard teachers who've been teaching a decade at least say, oh, I used to do that, of a particular technique I was introducing, and they no longer did it. So not only is there a problem about sharing to other colleagues, but there's even a problem that we have individually and as a profession of forgetting the things that we found effective, which I think is really difficult for teaching to develop as a profession. And there's always this cynical view that we're going through cycles. If you hang around, you'll see the next bus coming round. But the dangerous side of that is we forget those things that were effective. So in that sense, I think the WalkThrus is a serious contribution to capturing the wisdom, the practicality of the techniques that teachers know and might forget. So when it comes to communicating them, Dylan Williams adopted a phrase called lethal mutation. And in it, if you look at the image and you can imagine yourself, at times you've attended a course and a presenter, from their experience and from their reading, will translate that memory into a string of words, into an explanation of what constitutes the teaching. we just assume that the presenter has given an accurate and high fidelity explanation of a technique. And then as we listen, even though we might abstractly think, oh yes, I know we're prone to omission and commission and we don't listen accurately and we have our prejudices, we know that's true of other people, but I don't think we very rarely consider that we don't listen accurately. So we may well have a less than 100% accurate understanding and memory of what the presenter said. Then we go back into our classrooms, and then we try it out, and we naturally tinker with it. And then perhaps a later day, perhaps during the same day or the following day, a colleague will ask us what the course was, and then we recount our journey from listening to trying it out. And that colleague might say, oh, thanks, Oliver. Well, Oliver's not very good at this, so I think I'll change it. And then that continues, that word of mouth communication. And William reports and guesses that probably by the third or fourth such iteration, some of the key elements of the technique have probably been lost and they've become something else altogether. So in trying to find that mid-balance between too precise and too loose, this precise and provisional, I think we're aiming to hit that middle side in which it's memorable, it's shared understanding, and it develops over time. So when teachers can communicate now, if they have this sufficiently precise but provisional visual and verbal explanation, then the communication is more accurate. It also means that we can have conversations, because all the walkthroughs are context-free. Then we open up the possibilities of people from different ages and subjects being able to have a communication, because it's specific enough to apply to both, but it's not too specific, so they don't have something in common. So we consider that to be like a hub model. So people, if you think of the walkthrough at the middle with this shared vocabulary and sufficiently precise notion of what it entails, then people can come from different contexts, apply it, but they have this shared model in the middle, a raw, primitive, context-free model, which allows understandable communication. And it's kind of another subject, but as we talk about communication, I just want to talk about three-point communication. But this is particularly important with regards the feedback process involved in instructional coaching, in fact, any coaching. Normally, kind of the dynamics we have when we set up is face-to-face, because our instinct and everything we read about communication is the more human you can be, then the better it is. And the more human entails facing someone, having an open posture and looking not too intently, but looking into their face. For the recipient of such communication, whatever the skill of the coach, whatever the good intentions, it will all come over as being personal, because the words are directed to our face. And it's all, by definition, going to be personal, even if the intention explicitly said is it's not about the teacher, it's about the teaching. However, if we change the dynamics by being side by side, and not only is it physical, it's a metaphor for the coaching relationships, side by side learning, and you introduce what's called a third point, which of course becomes the walkthroughs, either paper or digital, then the communication becomes more objective. And so the feedback from the coach is directed towards the image, and we talk about the teaching and the actions. And the teacher, in that sense, saves face, and then it's really far easier to make it seem objective. So that's just kind of some of the reasons for the way in which how-tos can address some inherent difficulties in communicating and in terms of coaching. That's it, just those slides. We can move back out now, please, Paul, if you would.
Thank you. I think the lethal mutations can happen at very different scales and paces, can't they? I'm just thinking immediately of probably happens to all of us on this tonight, that you say something at a conference and someone tweets it in a way that's not entirely exactly what you said, and you come back and look at it afterwards and see on Twitter, Cat Scutt of the Chartered College says that schools should do X, and you think, not sure that was exactly the advice they gave, but great, wonderful to have that out there in the world. Very easy for things to be changed. Tom, did you want to sort of
yeah, and I
share
just found, you know, Oliver's clarity on this thinking just fantastically insightful and helpful when I'm, you know, referencing. It's like a lot of things when you sort of have a formula for explaining why things have always been a problem in the past. And since Oliver and I have been working together, it's become so clear to me that this is kind of the stuff I was missing. So the 3-point communication is so useful. This idea that when you're just talking face to face with somebody, the ideas you're sharing are kind of like hanging in the air, and they're ephemeral. They're not fixed enough. So that I've had conversations with a tutor in a FE college, say about a retrieval practice technique. He can hear the words I'm saying. I can hear the words he's saying, but what we're talking about in his head is not the same thing I'm talking about in my head. And we're not actually communicating. We think we are, but we're not. So when I go to observe his practice, it's like, oh gosh, no, that's not what we meant at all. Because this is, when you've got it there written down, it's just so much more easy, because you can say, look, this is what we can both see the same thing. It's sort of laid out, and you can discuss the mechanics of it in a sort of impersonal way. And then there's no shifting. It's sitting there like static. And that's so useful as a communication tool, this 3-point communication. I don't think it's a trivial thing. I think it's quite important. When you just this constant assumption that we all know what each other means is a real issue in training. And I see it in team meetings. You know, we all go, yeah, well, good, great. We all clear about that. Yes. And actually, no, it turns out that none of us agreed about this thing at all. You know, we all left the room with a slightly different sense of the intensity of something, or how frequently to do it, or even the very fundamentals of how to do some basic strategies. So I found this sort of thinking really helpful. And also there seems to be an appetite for it, this sort of toolkit. Like there's a lot of research engagement going on, which is great, but actually kind of nailing down a kind of some specifics from that has been really, I think people have found that quite useful. But it's interesting how some people react against it. And this stuff about, you know, I pick this up on Twitter all the time, sort of, and I sort of get a bit cross about it, because I feel like some quite experienced teachers underplay the level of their own tacit knowledge. And you think, why are you making it so difficult for newer teachers or struggling teachers to get better by saying, oh, it's much more complicated than that the whole time? That just really doesn't help. Oh, it's more complicated than that. It's not just this. There's more to it than that, as if it's all some sort of weird, untouchable art that no one can quite put their finger on. That's just so destructive to people's sense that it's achievable and there are steps you can take. And of course, then you integrate it into this thing. But it doesn't start off like some juggling act. I don't know. I think people should be a bit more honest about the step-by-step nature of teaching, because it can be described.
Yeah, and I think there's an important point there, isn't there, almost about, you know, it's that you kind of have to know the rules before you can break them. That absolutely teaching is complicated. There's no question about that, but there are some principles that we can start with, and then we can kind of start to build on those as our expertise and our understanding and our tacit knowledge sort of develops around those. And I think that's really important. And, you know, it's challenging, because when we think about evidence-based practice, something that's very much at the heart of my role and the work at the Chartered College, is sometimes I feel like the more that I read, the less certain I become about things, because actually what you read is all of the situations where this sort of rule of thumb doesn't apply. But actually, you've still got those vast majority, you know, we know that on average, this is a best bet. And then actually, as we develop our understanding, as we apply that in our context, as we use our professional expertise, we understand where those adaptations need to be made. We understand where those principles don't apply. And the fact that these principles don't necessarily apply universally perfectly in every situation isn't a reason not to understand those principles in the first place. Actually, your expertise is kind of developing and understanding how those don't apply. Oliver, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, Atul Gawande, in his checklist manifesto, is very insightful across many disciplines, professions. He noted how the star performers were the ones who objected mostly to having their star skills being made explicit and democratic, because if it was made explicit and available to everybody, they wouldn't have this star quality. They wouldn't stand out. It wouldn't be so precious. And they wouldn't get paid as much in terms of other professions. So they're really motivated for it not to be known. I'm not saying teachers are like that, but there may be something unconscious going on about So we verbalize it's more complicated than that, but they fail to notice that there are steps on the way.
Sorry, Oliver. Someone's just asked what was the name of that person you've just mentioned.
Atul Gawande. He's a practicing surgeon and a columnist and author in the New York Times, and he writes about coaching. And
Fabulous.
This manifesto is part of the arsenal of instructional coaches.
Fabulous. So the last question that I had really, before we move on to audience questions, we've got quite a few already, but if people have any further questions they want to add, please do get those going in the chat. Was Oliver just talking really about why visuals are so important in learning? You've made reference to this before, and obviously a lot of your earlier work was talking about how teachers can use visuals with pupils to strengthen the learning of their pupils. And then in this new piece of work, obviously looking at how we can use visuals to help teacher learning. It would be great just to go a little bit into the detail of why visuals are so important and how they can work.
I think Tom really touched on the most important point from a practical point of view. When we have communication, both parties assume that each other understands each other. Actually, David Sibbett, who worked with Apple and Silicon Valley in the early days, he found that not having visual communication was enormously expensive because people went away with what they assumed was what everyone else had understood. What was happening is they were relating to their own personal private interpretation as opposed to a public shared understanding. So from a professional point of view, that's actually what we want. And in terms of the conversations in the classroom that Tom talks about, I would argue that's more likely, and someone is more likely to be willing to share having their ideas prodded, and it being less a personal experience. So instead of looking at the pupil, you would look at a diagram and say, which bit do you think, does this belong to here? Is that part of this, or is that sequential, or is it causal? In other words, does it cause it, or does it just come afterwards? So those kind of seemingly abstract notions can be explored very practically, very objectively, in a way that doesn't trigger those personal negative and unproductive emotions.
I found with the walkthroughs, it's been interesting. Like the way we've written the book is sort of this in terms of the process of thinking of the ideas and then breaking it down. Then Oliver sort of illustrates essentially from the text, and sometimes they're just literally, a person standing there sort of pointing, and you kind of imagine the action. You sort of get into the space of the teacher acting out. But sometimes they're more abstract, and sometimes it just sort of almost like hits you with a kind of, oh, what's happening here? And it makes you think, like, what is happening there? And that makes you kind of think, have I thought about this enough? And it makes you pause to think. And I think you can't really look at the pictures like as if there is no text, but also without the pictures, the text is harder to follow. It's interesting the way they combine. Some of them are harder to do than others in terms of the abstraction, but I think it is that mixture of there's a synthesis there, which is fascinating. I mean, they just definitely work better together than apart.
Can I add a third thing? It's relating to Jim Knight of instructional coaching and Richard Mayer, Richard Mayer says we learn better with words and images than words alone. In terms of instructional coaching, I think ideally you have the images, you have the words, and then you have the action. So if you follow Jim Knight's notion, instructional coaches should be able to model those things. So when you have the text, the image, and then you have someone modeling it, it's incredibly powerful in terms of learning, because we know that we tend to be distracted by surface features. So if Tom and I were looking at a technique and we understand it, we talk about the walkthrough, then Tom says, I'm going to model this. As I look at Tom teaching, I'm not looking at him like I used to. I'm now looking at him through the framework that we've established by talking about the walkthroughs, which in turn have been supported because of the text and the images. So I'm a far more subtle and accurate and productive viewer, which of course is really significantly useful when we talk about the coaching relationships. So then when we come back and we talk about, Tom would say, what did you notice, Oliver? So I'm normally the coachee, and I'm talking about the coach. So then that puts me on the spot to notice what he did in relation to the model of the walkthroughs. So it becomes really sophisticated and really powerful. And I think it makes us more accurate in our observations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And someone's just mentioned why this is why they work so well, kind of with trainee teachers as well. And interestingly, we had a webinar just 2 weeks ago with Tom Bennett and Amy Forrester talking about behaviour. And one of the questions that came up that I don't think we quite got to was this question of how challenging it can be as a new teacher to go and observe a very effective teacher, and you don't see them doing any behaviour management because the class behave well. But actually, if you have given them in advance of that these specific techniques that the teacher is using, then they can be looking out for those techniques. So I think it's easy as a new teacher to kind of go and try and watch a teacher around behaviour management and be looking out for someone to do something wrong for the teacher to then intervene. But actually, what's really helpful, if you've got those list of kind of the strategies that teachers are using to kind of preempt any problems, you can be watching for those instead. And the way in which you're observing becomes much more powerful, and it makes it much more easy to then go, okay, I understand how this works in practice. I can start to do these things myself. And I think that's a really sort of useful way to be working, for sure.
There is a link with Doug Lemore. In his 42 rules, he said, call your shots. Before any observation, call your shots. So that's something that happens in pool. If there's a foul shot, you have to declare, I'm going for that one. So in this sense, it's not really a good idea to just go and watch someone and modelling. You need to do some preparatory work to prepare and shape your perception. You're looking specifically for something. Sorry, Tom.
No, I was going to say, I mean, one of the most insightful things I heard this year was at the last research ed I went to in Cardiff, where Dylan William would do this video bit, and he said that the knowledge you have as a teacher is like the knowledge you have riding a bike. That you can't be told what to do. You have to work it out. You have to get up on the bike and make sense of all that information you've seen, and you've seen bike riding happening hundreds of times, but until you're actually doing it, you don't know quite what that feels like for you to be doing it. And that's exactly what teaching's like. Until you may read something about a questioning technique, but until you're in a class with your class, actually not just any class, and you're seeing what that feels like to be doing these things with your actual students, you can't really do it. So I feel that this concept is it really works in a coaching context. It's about you doing it, feedback, discussion, improvement. It's not like a instructional manual, there you go, off you go. It just isn't like that. And so you have to bring yourself into it. You have to say, it's not just a teacher doing the strategy, it's me. I'm the one doing it. I know myself. I know what my tendencies are. I know where I'm confident. I know I'm a bit awkward, and that's the truth of it. So I think that's we really to be clear about that. Every teacher brings themselves into the room with their stuff, and the extent to which you can kind of change your practice to be more effective depends on how many of these things you can absorb and try. But it's part of a process. Sometimes you can't see yourself, and that's one of the things I find most interesting doing my work is seeing the things that teachers can't see about their own practice because they're so busy doing it. But I can say, did you notice for that student what it felt like to be in your class was like this? And sometimes it's a revelation. Like, oh my God. It's so easy to be kidded into thinking 3 or 4 students hyper enthusiastic engagement is representative, and sometimes it just isn't. It's a mask. Sometimes that like shrouds the wall of confusion that's at the back of the room, and because of the enthusiasts, you don't even notice. And I see that type of real challenge for teachers is real and not easy to just sort of deal with. Anyway.
No, and I think that's a really just basically a sort of good point to finish this bit of conversation on, is that the sort of simplicity and preciseness of the strategies that are covered in your book is not by any means suggesting that teaching is easy. And that's I think where some of the kind of tension can arise, that if it looks like, okay, it's just a set of these steps, anyone can do it, a robot can do it, that completely misunderstands the whole notion of what you're trying to do here. And in fact, the complexities of teaching, that it is really challenging, it is really difficult. But the more that we can do to sort of structure and support people into the teaching profession and support them in developing these strategies and techniques, the easier that we can make that, really. And we know how critically important that is in the kind of current context of recruitment and retention. I'm going to hop on now to some questions from the audience, because we've had some great ones coming through. A couple of questions have been around application of some of the strategies, and particularly the ones you've talked about tonight, Tom, in a kind of online environment or in a sort of COVID environment. So, how you do things like cold calling, think, pair, share in an online environment, or think, pair, share, how you do that in a sort of or something that achieves the same goals in a face-to-face environment where pupils are not supposed to be working in pairs and you're trying to keep space between pupils. What approach would you take there, Tom?
Oh, well, first thing to say is that, I mean, I've only had to do this to a limited extent with some adults in some teaching scenarios. So I'm no expert in this particular situation. However, I think there's some of the principles apply. So check for understanding, I think, is one of the most important things. Like if you've got to get away from just sort of delivery and hoping that's received. So more checking for understanding. So even if you've got if it's a kid sort of remotely in the class, cold calling and saying, okay, so I think I've explained what I mean. John, just how am I doing? You know, just check back. What do you think you've understood from this passage or about the question 2 or whatever? And John can tell you from wherever he is, or even if he's on the screen, you know, John, like, can I just ask you, like, just check back. What have you understood? And I think that type of thing is really important. So that combines the cold calling and the check for understanding. You can do that in any situation. And I would say where you have less organic feeling around by moving around in the room, you need to do that more deliberately. So you need to perhaps do it more extensively, checking that individual students are getting it. Do they know the instructions? Do they know the ideas? And the other one, the pair, I mean, I found that in a classroom, and I've discussed this with some teachers doing it last week, that, you know, when classrooms are all yellow taped and they're standing at the front to keep away, even with a gap between, you can say, like, who is your talk partner? And actually, if everyone, even in a classroom where everyone is talking across to there, as long as you know that's your talk partner, you can actually talk to them at a distance and talk to them without shouting. You can talk whispering, and you can actually establish, it can either be a back to back or across the aisle. You can establish a fairly workable pair discussion. It's just at a distance, but you just need to know who that person is. And I've seen that. I saw that working well with adults. Everyone was talking across the aisle, separated, but because there was no confusion about who it was meant to be, they just had these conversations, and it worked nicely. So, in fact, it made it even more necessary to be really clear who is your talk partner. So my experience so far is that all of those things work. You just need to be even more definite that this is the strategy I'm doing, and then you avoid this risk of assuming people are hearing and understanding when actually they might not be.
Thank you. The next one, Oliver, I wonder if you want to have a think about this. Is someone's asked, what would be your first steps in establishing 3-point communication as practice in a school where that doesn't yet happen?
I would introduce the concept. What I've done personally on a course is I give them a couple of sentences feedback, which is rigorous, but it's not rude. And I get them to give it to their partner, and I ask the partner beforehand to be ready to check their physical and emotional sensations and the thoughts going on in their head. And even though they know, and I know when you do role play, people go over the top, but nonetheless, I've asked them to be restrained and do it in a professional manner. But when people are honest and they actually check, the degree to which they're holding their breath, their stomach tightens, they have thoughts, they get a bit hotter, it's pretty much always an emotional response. And then simply I get them to role play, go side by side, give the same information as if it was referring to a third point, something visual, either a checklist or whatever, or walkthrough. And then the person to check what it feels like. And it just feels significantly different. So a simple comparison of what it feels like.
Interestingly, this is my question now, sorry, but as the host of this, I have the chance to ask questions when I want to. How do you think there's a way of approaching that online? So again, particularly with a move to kind of, I'm thinking about teacher communication here still, but people who are maybe having coaching online, or professional development models are kind of changing to online approaches. Is there a way you can think of making that work?
Well, if I were coaching someone with the how-tos, we'd have a face-to-face, and I'd say, right, let's either preparing for observation or post-observation. I'd simply bring the walkthrough up. I'd go over whatever they had agreed might be some of the adaptations. So we'd have that acknowledged and up front, and then I'd go through it. What I haven't yet done might be to look at the language. So instead of saying you, we might find a way of saying, now, the teacher, that kind of sounds a bit awkward, but I think we can look at a way at the language. So we're both looking at a shared image. There are three, even though they're not in the same room, and we're projecting what we saw. We're securing the memory in terms of this external image, this 5-step process, and then we're framing everything in there.
I found that worked well in a school where I did some training where they were, well, we launched some ideas. They had to select some walkthroughs to work on in their area. But when in the area sessions, they had the walkthroughs that on the screen, and I saw a group of maths teachers having this really good discussion about whether or not, when they're doing modelling and worked examples, whether it was like the example, and it's that thing of, do we do it like that? I mean, how do you do worked examples? But how many do you do? And am I modelling enough up front? All those sorts of discussions. But it was about a visual representation of thing rather than, when we do that worked examples thing, it was this kind of set out version. So you just have something to look at, to share. And that was in a kind of small group thing. Now that could be online if you had to do that. You could be looking, you can show the representation of the process and then discussing whether or not you're doing it, or you can just self-reflect. A lot of people have found this sort of thing of having a video or an online tool and then reflecting against a framework. So rather than just saying, how well am I doing worked examples? I've got a structured reflection because I've got the 5 steps. I'm thinking, am I doing worked examples like this? And then it's like, well, no, I'm not. I'm doing it like this. And then you can evaluate whether you think your method's better or not. So any just having the framework, it's like a bouncing board. It's like a board to reflect against mainly. I think that's its main benefit in a way. It's like, it's not rigid enough to be.
No, there's also an element of cognitive load. So we often get overloaded, and we talk about it and we read the research, but I don't think we're necessarily attuned enough to notice when it happens to us. By having an image out there in its 5 steps, we're not going to miss anything out. So it becomes an aide-memoire as well. It's like it's your working memory is there. Right now I've got more capacity to be a bit more analytic.
And some others are suggesting, which I think is a nice idea, is that, obviously there are a range of different things that you can use as that kind of third point. So you might also use, for example, a video of a technique. So thinking of sort of Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion style videos. On the Charter College's Early Career Teacher Hub, we have a whole selection of videos that we developed as part of an early career framework based program. So again, just videos of techniques, and they're not, in many cases, they're not absolutely perfect examples. They're filmed in real classes, but they give you something to reflect on about how you might be doing things differently. It's almost like that kind of popular sports coaching app where you see the kind of perfect example or a different example and you compare yours to that. That it's having that something that's a kind of a third point to focus on other than just you two. Another question, that either of you might want to respond to this, but what can teachers do if they're working in a school where the senior leadership team wants a teaching approach adopted by everyone that clashes with the kinds of approaches advocated in this book? This is a question I think we get asked at virtually every webinar, is what do we do if our SLT say don't do that?
Rebel. my honest view is that, there's only so many things you can work on as a teacher, and if you're working on sensible things which are allowing students to do better work, then I think that's fine. So I think we have to think of it from the perspective of the learning rather than the performance of the teacher. So that's something we're constantly saying. And when in our adapt strategy, the T means test, which means can you tell it's making a difference in terms of student learning? Are they learning more? Are they more fluent? Is their work better? Now, if you're doing things which are supporting students to perform better and learn more, then who can argue with that? And sometimes it could be a marking strategy, a questioning technique. I'm not quite sure how radical you have to be in a lesson to actually ask questions the way you want, and do, which is like so subversive that some SLT person is going to have a fit about it. But so it'd probably be interesting to discuss the specifics. But I do really think if we're thinking about maximizing learning, and then you can demonstrate, look, I'm really getting some really great outcomes. Look at this. And you can say, well, and if, to the point where they're saying, well, how did you manage that? Well, you say, well, this is the technique that I find really works. Then you've got evidence. If you're just sort of doing it because you feel like it, well, maybe you should ask yourself the question, should I be doing it then? if you can't produce that evidence that your strategies are working, then why are you using them? And maybe it's a bad choice. So I do think you need to think hard about that. That's the way I'd go about it, though. You've got to be sure in your own self that with some evidence that the thing you are hoping to persuade other people of is actually a good idea.
Yeah, and I think it's important, isn't it, in the whole kind of approach of evidence-based practice, it's about drawing on published research, but it's also having ways of telling what's working in your context. And teaching, like many other professions, I'm sure, is there's a kind of, you've talked about this earlier, the kind of professional amnesia, Oliver, that there are these kind of cycles where things kind of come in and go out of fashion. And there's almost a pressure to constantly innovate, that we have to be doing something new or something different or trying something new. But actually, that's not always helpful. That it's understanding, is what we're trying that's new, maybe that's good, but is it? How do we know if it's helping, or are we just doing something new for the sake of it because we feel like we must be constantly innovating, changing, developing? That sometimes reflecting on whether that's helping or not doing anything or actually making things worse is really important. Oliver, I'm conscious we're quite short of time, so this may be the last question, but someone's asked if you could explain how your work around this book and the sort of approach you take to instructional coaching either builds on or challenges the instructional coaching model that Paul Bambrick-Santoyo promotes in his work.
I've read his book. I don't think I'm sufficiently well read to be able to contrast the details. So I don't think I can answer that.
I could. I think it supports it pretty well because I mean, there's a fantastic bit in Leverage Leadership where he talks about observation and feedback. And he's very clear that the most effective feedback is quite strongly iterative, where you've got a very sharp focus and you give feedback, which is then sort of, well, you generate feedback through discussion and then the teacher commits to doing the thing they've said they're going to do and you follow that through. And that's that intensity. So it's selective. He has these great sort of myths, is this true? No, it's not, because, and some key principles. I think our work really supports that strongly because it's asking people to select something and focus on it with the instructional coaching dimension. But we are sort of suggesting ideally you have multiple feedback loops within a reasonably short period of time, not like 2 formal observations a year and, that kind of thing. So I am a big fan of his work and it's definitely influenced me in my thinking about it. So I would say there's a strong compatibility.
Great, and thank you, Oliver, there for modelling that it's okay to not know the answer even when you're cold called. That's brilliant. I am actually going to sneak one more question in because I think it's a particularly interesting one. So someone's asked whether any of the strategies or techniques that you reflect on in this book are ones that are particularly helpful for supply teachers, which I think is interesting in the context of what we talked about of knowing your class and being able to make those decisions. If you're with a class you don't know, are there things that you think are still the absolute kind of critical ones to focus on?
I'd go signal, pause, insist. Like, hello, my name's Mr. Sherrington. I'm your teacher today. My signal for attention is this, or this is the school signal for attention, so to show that you know it. So let's just practice it. And so you can practice getting everyone listening when you need them to, and you show that you're going to do that. So you're sort of asserting a kind of, so I'm going to make sure everyone's listening when I'm talking, and then that's a principle that you always have. There's always a signal, and that you rehearse it, and that you insist that you're going to make everyone listen. If you do that right up front, and the students will go, oh great, that's what all the other teachers do, we're in safe hands, and they'll sort of trust you. And if you just go in and start going, guys, shh, everyone's going, oh god, it just doesn't feel nearly as assertive. So something which models assertiveness is that signal, pause, insist, and doing that is a top tip.
Unfortunately, Tom, I think it was the latter of your descriptions there that probably described my my attempts to do cover lessons as a new teacher. But I think that's really helpful. Thank you. So look, we're right on 5:30. So I wanted to just wrap up by saying a huge thank you to Tom and Oliver. It sounds like from the comments, many people have read your book already, but hopefully this gave a bit of a taste of some of the things in it. And again, if you're a Chartered College member, you can access a discount on John Cat books. You can find that information on my college on the website. If you aren't already a member, please do take a look at Chartered College membership. I know this is an open access webinar, so we've got a whole range of people here. We have recorded this webinar as well, and that will again be available for members on my college in a couple of days once it's been edited and popped up there. There's a whole range of new resources that we're publishing. Again, if you're not a member, the Education Exchange is our new open access website, which is all about discussing some of the big issues in education. It's open to anyone around the world to contribute. There's videos, there's discussions, there's articles from a whole range of people. And then again, a whole load more articles on our membership sites and in our new issue of Impact, which started landing with people today. A huge thank you again to Tom and Oliver, and a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us on this busy Monday. I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.